Hey everyone, welcome to this week's ProMAX Tech Talk. We're going to be talking about how to choose a camera for your video team or your project. Joining me today, we have some of our tech team. We have Mike and Taylor, and we have Nathaniel. So guys, let's just get started. Mike, I'll start with you. What are the main components of a camera that are important to the video production process? You want to dive into that for us?
So with cameras, it really depends on what you're looking at. With like DSLRs, you're going to obviously be looking at the lens components and also a camera body. With some of the higher end cameras, it's going to be similar. With camcorders, you're going to be more like a fixed lens more than anything. So you're going to be looking at like higher end, you're going to be looking at iris diaphragms. With lower end, you're going to be looking at lens components, controls for manual exposure, anything with deal with aperture, just all sorts of manual components like the normal cameras you see nowadays. Are you looking for more like controls, or just to kind of specify?
Let's just kind of dive into like a general overview of like the different parts of a camera. So like let's start with like the aperture stuff. Do you want to dive into some of those a little bit deeper, like what the difference between a high-end one and a low-end camera is? Like what should you be looking for?
Yeah, so like I believe I haven't really delved with a lot of the red cameras, but I believe you have your iris diaphragm, so you can actually play around with your apertures on there manually. However, like a DSLR, you're going to be controlling it through the camera, through each individual lens more than anything. So depending on what lens you have on your camera with DSLR, you can go all the way up to like, f1.2, adjust your aperture and blades that are inside each lens from there. So.
Okay. So when we're talking about cameras, there's different resolutions. Like what is the big thing that distinguishes the resolutions? Like what makes one camera able to shoot 4K compared to a camera that's just shooting in standard HD?
That's mostly the sensor, but also the software, I should say, that's built into the camera itself. Nowadays, everyone's going 4K, even all the way up to like 8K. I believe that's about the standard nowadays. 1080 is still fine for just normal, just easy upload to like, YouTube or Vimeo and whatnot. Just for standard broadcasts. So 1080 is still like becoming the low end. 4K is more the average now. And I don't know if anyone else is pushing anything higher than 8K. I believe like even TVs for output is still, 4K is becoming the average and 8K is still relatively new.
Okay. So a lot of the difference in resolution has to do with like pixels. Like, Nathaniel, do you want to dive in a little bit like what the difference between those resolutions is as you go up the scale from standard HD to 8K?
Yeah, I mean, the thing to think about is, HD is, 1080 by 1920, or the other way around, 1920 by 1080. But once you go to 4K, you're quadrupling that. Once you go to 8K, you're quadrupling 4K. So it's exponentially bigger as you go up the path. What a lot of people, even professionals, don't always necessarily realize is the size of the files and the bandwidth of those files is not necessarily a one-to-one ratio between pixels, and like a 4K file isn't just automatically 4 times bigger than an HD file. It depends on the data rate, and it depends on the codec and format, all those things. Sometimes people are shooting on 4K and it's smaller file sizes than HD. So that's definitely something to keep in mind with your camera settings. A lot of cameras have variable bit rates these days. If you can control the bit rate of the file as well as the resolution, that can be nice because you can often, go up to 4K and not add a larger file or higher bit rate. You get a little bit less out of the image itself, but that can be a really good option for some people, depending on if the camera has that option.
Okay, so how would someone go about controlling the bit rate and those different aspects you were just talking about to be able to manage those file sizes?
Yeah, I mean, those are just all settings within any camera. I'll go really super basic here. On my phone, which, nowadays phones are incredible cameras. I've got a 4K sensor, and I record 4K at 100 megabits per second all the time. It looks great. It's a reasonable size file, but I can go in and increase that to 300 megabits per second in the app that I use for recording. So that's a separate setting in my phone and in most cameras these days. It's a separate setting to say what file size do you want, or what aspect ratio do you want, how many pixels do you want, versus what kind of bit rate do you want to be shooting at. And generally speaking, the higher bit rate is going to give you more color depth, is generally what you're going to get out of it. It also depends on the camera. Sometimes, like, honestly, with my phone, I don't expect that it's getting more color information at higher bit rates. I think it's just making me feel like I've got a higher end file.
Okay.
Just depends on the camera, though.
Sounds good. And then just for people who might not understand what like a bit rate is, can you just explain what bit rate is to people, someone who doesn't understand necessarily what that is?
Yeah, so bit rate is just how large the file is. It's usually shown as like 100 megabits per second. So you can take that 100 megabits and divide it by 8 to get the megabytes per second. And then you can kind of do the math from there to figure out how much storage that 100 megabit file is going to be if you shoot for 30 minutes.
Okay. And then just to take it one step further, there's bit rate and there's frame rate. Can you explain the difference between those two as well? Just feel like there might be some confusion between the two.
Absolutely. So your bit rate is it determines the size of the file, and frame rate determines how many frames are happening in each second. So I think there's a little bit of confusion because they're both kind of rates, right? But like in Europe, everything is 25 frames per second. Over here in the US, we're generally either 24 or 2997. And that means, every second of video in Europe has 25 individual frames. And over here in the US, every second of footage generally has, we'll call it 30 frames. So that's your frame rate. And that's just how many of those independent pictures you have in each second of video, versus bit rate, which is how much data is being eaten up by this video stream.
Okay. And then, so besides what we've touched on so far, are there any other pieces of information that people should really like have a good understanding of what's coming from the camera before they really dive into choosing one and diving into their video projects, or have we covered all of those so far?
Mike, what are your thoughts? Taylor? Mike, you probably know the most about cameras here.
To an extent. I'm more prosumer than anything, personally. As far as like choosing cameras, it really depends on what application you're really shooting for. Because I have a wide range of cameras, but it's more prosumer. Obviously, I don't own a red camera on my own for no reason to spend 30 grand on something just for myself. Yeah, it depends on the application. Like I shoot on a Sony A9, so I can do photos and video. Whereas if I want to shoot low light, get a bigger sensor, get something like an A7S, something like that. Or if you're doing like action shots, you want to go like more of a light kind of style camera, maybe like a GoPro or like the Insta360s if you don't want to like really think about where you're shooting and whatnot. I'm gonna close TeamViewer here.
You're doing simultaneously doing tech support.
Yeah, I'm just getting notifications of the server turning on and off like all day. So
it's all good.
So when you're saying it depends on what application you're going to be in, are you talking strictly about like the editing software? So whether you're going to be in like Photoshop for photos or something like that, or were you talking something else?
More like what are you shooting essentially? Because if you're gonna do something like you're gonna do photos and videos, you might want to choose a camera that that can do both. Or if you're strictly video, and like I said, if you want to do more low light, then you want to go like a different sensor. And in this sense. It'll be like an A7S or S3, whatnot, because it's a different type of sensor for low light. Versus an R would be more for photo because higher pixels for photos. But obviously, if you're going to invest in one of those, and if you want to like mount something, you don't want to put that on like a car or something. You want to get something smaller and not endanger parts. If you want to go like a GoPro, you can throw that around. So it really depends on your application. So.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Mike. Do you have something you're going to say?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with start with what you're trying to shoot and kind of go from there. Don't discount high-end phones these days. The iPhone 11, an S10. I've got a OnePlus Pro. Those things are amazing. For certain videos, right? Like if you're in a well-lit spot and you're doing talking head stuff, shoot, we own a red camera here at ProMaX, and half of the time for like our blog content, we're using our phones, right? Because it's arguably better in some ways than our older red camera. But yeah, the newer GoPros, like Mike, you touched on the action shooting stuff. Like newer GoPros have really, really good stabilization built in, which is awesome.
Yeah.
So, if you're doing any sort of sports footage, that's hugely helpful. And then at the same time, once you get into where things get complex with cameras is when you're really getting into lower lighting, when you have very complex lighting where some things are darker and some things are lighting. When those kinds of applications, that's where you have to have something that goes beyond the just basic range, basic prosumer stuff.
Okay, perfect. So thanks for all that information, guys. So moving on to the next topic is, so besides your application, how do you choose your camera? How do you choose what hardware you're going to have around that? So what storage server you're going to put it on, what workstation you're going to be using, what editing software. I know in one of our last talks, you talked about choosing your workstation or cameras and workstations and how they go together. Do you mind starting us off talking about that?
Yeah, I just always think it's true to kind of line up all of your technology so it makes sense together. It's like getting dressed in the morning. Like I'm in a button-down shirt and some nice jeans. I'm not going to wear like super fancy tuxedo dress shoes with this. It would look ridiculous, right? And it's really, honestly, no different with technology. Like if you're shooting on a, iPhone 11, you don't need the new Mac Pro Tower. You just don't. But that said, if you're, don't get really excited and go spend $40,000 on a nice, RE setup or a nice red setup, and then expect to edit that on MacBook Pro. That's not going to work well either. So it's kind of like, there's a lot of really cool, really good quality stuff on the super low end these days. Like that's where technology blows my mind. Like whether it's a camera or a computer or storage, like you can get something amazing for $1,000. But if you're going to spend, and I'm being super generic here, but if you're going to spend $20,000 on a camera, don't expect to spend $1,000 on your workstation and vice versa.
Okay, makes sense. So Taylor, let's take this one to you. So I know sometimes when people come to us looking for a server, we ask them what kind of codecs they're working in. That's obviously coming from the camera. Why is that important to when you're purchasing your server?
I mean, the number one reason there is just bitrate and, well, more specifically data rate per stream. So if you got 4 editors and they're each working on like 2 to 3 streams of ProRes 422, you're going to need a certain amount of, you're probably going to need 10 gig at that point or something like that if you're working in 4K. But if you're working in 1080p, you can probably get by on 1 gig without much issue. And making sure that your network pipeline, the actual disk performance of the server itself, and the network connection on your workstation all line up to ensure that you get a clean stream of data for your editing application. That's the goal of that question, really, is to just ensure that we're providing what you need.
Okay, so is there any other part of the server build that is impacted by that, or is it just making sure you have everything lined up so everything's going to flow the right way?
I mean, outside of if you're doing something where you're, transcoding, say, 4K into some editable codec, rather than editing directly in R3D, you're probably going to be only worried about your disk performance and your network performance on the server side.
Okay, so there's nothing really else from the camera that really has to play with that?
Nope, that's where the NLE comes in, because if your NLE doesn't support whatever codec your camera's recording, you're probably going to need to transcode it, and that's where, GPU and CPU on the server side is going to matter if you're doing the transcoding there. If you're doing the transcoding on your workstation and just, pulling the file from the server, transcoding it, pushing it back, etc., you're probably still fine. But if you want to offload that, processing, that's where the, more performance-oriented part of the server in terms of transcoding, CPU, GPU, that stuff will come into effect.
Okay. So now, since you brought up the NLE, obviously there's a lot of codecs out there. Most of them are pretty common and are supported by a lot of the main NLEs out there. Are there any certain codecs that come from cameras that are like they're different than that? They kind of sit in their own little category of these are, let's just call them like a special codec where you need extra hardware or upgraded hardware to be able to work with them?
It really depends on the codec. There are some codecs that come from, an iPhone 11 Pro that if you try to edit in Premiere on a Windows workstation, you're going to run into some trouble unless you have a really, high horsepower system. And then if, you're recording something like Blackmagic Raw and Red Raw and DPX and stuff, you're going to have some issue playing that kind of stuff back in, Premiere, and Avid will strictly require you to transcode it into a DNX codec. So there's a combination of factors there in the NLE and in the codec itself.
Okay. Mike, let's take it back to you. So you were talking earlier about picking a camera based on what you're shooting, whether it's like action, like an action shot with a GoPro or something on your phone, or moving up to a RED camera. I've seen a lot of people that use DSLRs for a lot of their video. So what's the difference between using a DSLR and a camcorder, specifically talking about video, not like taking out like still photos?
So with the camcorder, you have more of a built-in lens. Let me turn off my email now. So with that built-in lens, you're kind of restricted what that camera's built for. So let's just say you have like an older Canon 8, I think it's like CX or HX. You can only zoom in so much with that optical lens that's built in, and I believe the aperture's fixed on those. I could be wrong. Whereas if you get a DSLR, you can actually interchange all those lenses. So depending on what lens you have, you can be a fixed prime lens that can have more of an open aperture all the way up to like 1.2, or if you want to go in the lower end, be like f2.8 or f4. And then you can zoom in between like 70 to 200 or 2470. You have variable zooms, variable specific primes, different apertures. There's all sorts, and then depending on the glass that you buy too, you'll have different quality of images that you'll get with DSLRs. Kind of goes the same with larger format cameras as well, because I believe some of the RED cameras and the RED Epic and some of the Blackmagic cameras, you can actually use like Canon adapters, so you can really use those lenses as well. So there's all sorts of differences between those.
Okay, cool. So those were actually all the questions I had for you guys today. I guess to wrap it up, let's just say someone comes to you and is like, I'm looking to get some new cameras. What would be like the top 5 questions you would ask that person before you gave them a recommendation? We'll start with you, Nathaniel.
Yeah, so top 5, I don't know if there's a 5 specific, but I'd always start with, what's your application that, what are you shooting? Like, is this talking head stuff? Is it action stuff? Are you shooting in low light? What are you shooting? I would start there, what's your budget? Those would probably be the top 2 things I'd ask. From there, what have you shot on before? What's your experience in editorial? If it's somebody that is, obviously somebody that's a professional, editor, producer, I might go higher end camera than somebody that's never used an NLE before. So those things can factor in. Yeah, those are probably the main things I would want to know.
How about you, Mike?
Actually, can you repeat that question? Because Taylor brought a light down and I did not hear what you guys said.
I forgot. I'm going to add one more. Am I allowed?
Absolutely. Go for it.
I'm so stupid for forgetting this. What's your audio plan? Like, that's a really important one too.
Do you want to elaborate on that a little bit? Like why that's important?
Yeah, I mean, these days, it's funny. It goes back to application, right? There's a ton of video happening in business, and more is even going towards phone-based recording. So we're actually seeing a lot of nice quality video being shot with really crappy audio these days. So people are really starting to notice audio more because there's kind of almost this like discrepancy that we're seeing more than we have in a long time, just because you can actually, your average Joe can shoot pretty decent video on a high-end phone, but they're still not going to get good audio. So it's always really important, bad audio just kills a video. So it's always just critical to understand, just like with, I wouldn't want to try to shoot something, a film on a GoPro. I also wouldn't want to use a RE camera to, take down a mountain if I'm skiing. But it's kind of the same with audio. I mean, there's shotgun mics, there's condenser mics. You can use lavaliers and attach them to people. There's wired, there's wireless, there's upsides and downsides to all of that. So factoring in your audio setup is a really important part as well.
Awesome. So Mike, the question was, if someone came to you like asking for camera recommendations, what questions would you ask them before you gave them a response?
Again, it's pretty much like, what are you shooting? Like, what's the end goal that you're looking for? Like the type of shooting, what you're shooting, where you're shooting, because climate does make a difference. Because weather sealed cameras do make a difference. Yeah, it's pretty much like, how are you shooting it? What's the outcome? How are you going to edit it? Like, what's your budget? That's the biggest thing that comes to mind, because that will be a big limiting factor. If, let's say, you have like $1,000 to spend, to Nathaniel's point, like, you can only spend so much with a camera, but then what's the point of buying like a camera if you can't buy the lenses, or if you can buy only a camera but you can't edit anything? So budget's a big factor. So those are the main things I would ask.
And Taylor, how about you?
I don't know anything about cameras.
Fair enough.
No, yeah, definitely the biggest point that I would say is just make sure that everything is on the same like playing field in terms of cost and quality. Because if you have a disparity in one portion of your workflow, either performance of a workstation, performance of your server, performance of your network, quality of your audio, quality of your video, it's gonna come out in the end a little awkward. Somewhere there's going to be something that someone's going to be like, hey, that's a blemish on the production value of that, finished product, because somewhere along the way it wasn't up to snuff.
All right.
I also love that we almost forgot to talk about audio, despite the fact that Mike is wearing an I Love SM58 shirt.
That is pretty funny.
My favorite part was watching Mike talk about video, and as he's actively sitting in the dark with like the worst quality webcam going on, I'm just like, God damn it.
We can't all be Brian with the perfect setup.
Yeah, where is Brian? We're talking about cameras and him and his beautiful DSLR
Network is
web.
down completely.
The internet in Tennessee has been shut off.
He's
The whole
apparently,
state.
They just shut off Tennessee.
he apparently wants to go on a crusade to burn down every Comcast office that's located in Tennessee.
There you go. There you go. Well, now he's flagged by the NSA.
Tennessee's been canceled.
Beautiful. All right. Before we wrap this up, is there any other words of wisdom that you guys have to offer? Going once, going
Do a lot of
twice.
research before you buy. Don't just
All
buy
right.
anything.
There you go.
But the best camera is what you have on you. So
Yeah, man, oh man, like you can shoot on a frickin' phone, and if you know what you're doing with editing and with color, like you will have a better product than somebody that's shooting with the greatest camera in the world that doesn't know what they're doing. Like it's all just tools. Like the artist behind the tools is what matters.
yeah, honestly, I shoot on my 11 Pro more than my Sony A9, and then I edit on my iPad Pro.
Yeah.
Mike's just a pro. All right, everyone. Well, thanks for joining us this week for this week's ProMAX Tech Talk. If you have any questions you want answered on a future episode, feel free to send them to us. We'll make sure we get them in there. If you're not already, start following our social media accounts below and hit that red subscribe button to get more video production tips from our team. We look forward to seeing you next week. Thanks for joining us. Have a good one.